Kathleen as a Spitfire. She's dynamite in a tiny little package. She has this huge story and joyful, zealous personality and so much grit, which I know has not come naturally to her, but God has just been telling an amazing story through her life and through her journey. And every time I've spent time with her, I leave so inspired. She just has a way of just making me want to step out in greater faith and lean in more to how God has created me. She just has that effect. And so Kathleen, she got her motorcycle endorsement 6.5 years ago at the age of 52. Yes, no kidding. Talk about just stepping into it. She has already traveled over 150,000 miles by bike through 49 states in the US, 11 Canadian territories and provinces, and 37 European countries, including Africa and Asia. Yeah, wow. And she's got a powerful story to share about how this whole journey has begun for her and what she's learned along the way. She has published 2 books. The first book is called Two-Wheeled Wind Therapy, and then Living at Full Throttle. And she has just so many stories to share about what God has taught her along the way. She loves Jesus. She's a follower of Jesus. She's a vital part of our community here at River West. She leads the singles ministry. And I think the rest of everything that she's going to share with you is just going to be a huge blessing to you this morning. It's going to be so encouraging. So let's welcome Kathleen.
Thank you so much, Pastor Marianne. I am truly honored and delighted to be here this morning. You know, my story is rather unusual because if you had asked me 6.5 years ago, I would have told you that there was no way that I would ever be brave enough or strong enough or skilled enough to ride my own motorcycle. In fact, when I first took my DMV required skills test back in 2018, I like to say that I failed spectacularly. So I rode on top of the cones, I drove outside the lines, and I couldn't even brake my motorcycle in time. And then when I went back a week later to retake that test, I got the lowest possible passing score. Even 2 years after that, I was still too afraid to ride up my own driveway. That was in 2020, and at that time, I was going through a really low point in my life. I was battling throat cancer, and I was going through a second divorce. And the chemo and radiation treatments caused the hair on the back of my head to fall out, and I actually lost the ability to eat or speak for several weeks. And I'm a high school math teacher, and I had to program my phone to speak for me in my classroom. At the time, I was really grappling with this visceral fear of being alone. I was afraid of living alone. I was afraid of riding my motorcycle alone. And I was also afraid of traveling alone. And on top of that, I was really struggling with significant feelings of shame and worthlessness. You see, I felt that I had made too many mistakes for God to ever use me for good again. And I have to be honest with you, there were many days where I laid on the bathroom floor and just cried because I felt such despair and hopelessness. But I'm so happy to be able to tell you that so much has changed since that time. Because God has shown me how I can take a series of small steps of faith to face my fears and to learn to live life more fully. So what happened is that shortly after my divorce, I joined 2 different women's Bible studies groups. And in both of these Bible study groups, I learned more about the very real presence of the Holy Spirit in my life. You know, at the time, I had been a Christian for over 40 years, and I did understand many of the basic concepts about God's word and the life of Jesus. But to be honest with you, there was so much I did not understand about the Holy Spirit. And what I learned in my conversations with these women is that the Holy Spirit was actually my helper and my friend. He could speak to me, he could teach me, he could even intercede for me. And as I became more aware of his presence, I began to understand that even when I was alone, he was with me. And so understanding more about his role in my life gave me the courage that I needed to face my fear of being alone and to head out on a 2-month motorcycle trip across the country by myself to see my son in Washington, D.C. Now, that trip ended up being life-changing for me because of the lessons that God taught me along the way. I have to be honest with you, though, when I left on that trip, I wasn't really sure how it was going to end up going. Because it's one thing to decide in a Bible study that God is always with you, right? And another thing entirely to pack your bags and head out by yourself for 8 weeks. But what I found, even in the beginning stages of that trip, as I traveled through Oregon and Washington and northern Idaho, was that I was able to appreciate the beauty of God's creation around me. I was able to sing praise songs. I was able to pray, think thoughts of gratitude. I also really enjoyed conversations with fellow travelers along the way, and I discovered that it was easier than I thought it might be to keep in touch with my friends and family back home. So what I began to learn, even in the very beginning stages of this journey, was that even though I was traveling on my own, I was not alone. And that was so incredibly freeing for me. From northern Idaho, I made it down to Custer, South Dakota, and from there, I decided to attempt something called an Iron Butt Association ride. Now, I know that name might sound like a rather indelicate joke, but it's actually the name of a highly respected international organization that certifies motorcyclists who can document that they've traveled long distances in short periods of time. And my goal was to travel 1,000 miles in less than 24 hours and to make it from Custer, South Dakota to St. Joseph's, Michigan. I really wasn't sure how well I would do because the furthest I'd ever gone in one day on a motorcycle was 400 miles, and I was traveling by myself. But I sat out and, did encounter obstacles and difficulties along the way, but I prayed to God for courage and wisdom and perseverance, and I ended up going further than I intended. I ended up going over 1,500 miles in less than 36 hours and made it to Niagara Falls. So what I found is that with God by my side, I was a much stronger person than I had realized. From there, I headed south to see my son in Washington, D.C., and I have to tell you, it was just so wonderful to be able to give him a hug, to talk with him, to tell him I loved him. And for me, the time was particularly healing because I had suffered so many losses in the previous year, and being able to focus on my blessings and what I had to be grateful for was so incredibly healing. After visiting my son, I headed south to a place called the Tail of the Dragon. Some of you may have heard of this place. It's very famous among motorcyclists because it's on the border of North Carolina and Tennessee, and they have over 300 curves in less than 11 miles. And I had actually been there twice before on the back of a motorcycle as a passenger. And I had seen with my own eyes the Tree of Shame, where motorcyclists can hang the parts from their totaled bikes. So to say that I was intimidated by this course would have been an understatement, but I did successfully complete it twice. And after doing so, I found that my confidence and my abilities as a motorcyclist increased. And I was also able, I think for the first time, to see myself as a biker in my own right instead of somebody else's riding partner. So from the Tail of the Dragon, I headed west and made it to California, and then up through California to Oregon, where I live. And during that time, I was able to stop and visit with several friends that I had had since when I was much younger. And one of them, I'm honored to say, is here with me today. But in my conversations with those women, we talked about some of the more difficult things that had happened in my life and some of the more challenging circumstances that I had had to deal with. And I was able to come to the realization that I had been looking at myself from entirely the wrong perspective, where I had been so fixated on all of my mistakes and failures. God had been looking at the lessons that I had learned from those trials and tribulations, where I had been so lost in the depths of my feelings of shame and worthlessness. He was looking at me as the daughter whom he deeply loved. And when I felt those depths of feelings of despair and hopelessness, he knew that he had a future and a hope for me. And what I began to understand is while the events of my past may have shaped who I was to some extent, they did not need to define me. You know, we have all had things happen to us that we wished maybe hadn't happened. And it is true that those events do create who we are to some extent today. But what I've learned is that it is up to us to decide, what do we want to do with our lives from today moving forward? So I came back from this first solo journey, able to see myself, I think, as a person of value and strength, maybe for the first time. I also had a much better understanding of the depth of God's grace and provision. So even though I continued to face fearful circumstances, I learned to start asking myself a very critical question. I started asking myself, what would I do if fear was not my first thought? And then I started asking God for the courage and the strength to take that step, whatever it might be. And I found that as I learned to move forward in faith, instead of getting stuck in my fear, I began to be able to take on more and more difficult challenges in my life. So the next summer, I decided to go to all 48 contiguous states on my motorcycle, and I also successfully completed a 2,000-mile Iron Butt Association ride. The following summer, in the spring of 2022, when the borders to Canada were open for the first time since the outbreak of the COVID pandemic, I made the decision to travel north from Oregon through Canada, and then through Alaska to Fairbanks, and then along the Dalton Highway to Prudhoe Bay in the Arctic Ocean. Now, Prudhoe Bay is the furthest northernmost point in North America accessible by road. And I was really excited about the idea of ticking a 49th state off of my list and also just going as far north as I could possibly go. But the funny thing is, shortly after I posted on Facebook that I was intending to make this journey, I had people from all over the world tell me all the reasons why I couldn't do it. They said that there were too many bears, that there wasn't enough gas, that the roads were terrible, and that I was a woman, and that I was traveling alone. And I have to tell you, I did carefully read every single response that I got, and I also prayed about my decision. And I decided that I would rather try to make it to the Arctic Ocean and fail than to not try because I might fail. So I did what I could to prepare. I went to a dirt bike training camp to get more comfortable on dirt and gravel. I got bear spray. I purchased gas cans for my motorcycle, And then I got a GPS tracking device with an SOS button, and I even rented a sat phone. And then I headed north. And I have to tell you that I did discover pretty quickly that everything that people had said about the roads was indeed true. So I found what I like to describe as potholes big enough to put a children's wading pool in, and cracks and crevices that I like to say were deep enough to lose a chihuahua in. But the funny thing is, it wasn't the roads themselves that were actually so horrible, it was the lack of roads. Because Alaska does so much road construction during the summer that I was encountering mile after mile of road construction with dirt and gravel. And on my heavy Harley Davidson, that is very difficult to manage. There was one road construction area that was rather demoralizing because the gravel was so deep and loose that even in first and second gear, I could barely keep the bike upright, and I was going very slowly. And the pilot car that was directing traffic through this area literally left me in the dust and made it to the end of the zone and came back with a line of semis before I could make it to safely. So needless to say, I was super relieved to make it to Alaska 5 days after leaving Oregon, and then shortly after that, I made it to Anchorage. In Anchorage, I dropped off my Harley, and I picked up an adventure bike from a private individual through a rider's share program, so I rented it from him. And I drove up to Fairbanks, and from there headed up the road through the Dalton Highway. Now, some of you may have heard of the Dalton Highway. Those of you that have heard of it know that highway is really not the best word to describe it. I like to describe it as a hiking trail with semis on it. So it's about 500 miles of mostly dirt and gravel, and it is considered one of the most dangerous roads in the world for several reasons. There is heavy semi traffic. There are winter weather conditions, even during summer. There's almost no services and almost no cell phone reception. And there are about 40 fatalities a year on this road, primarily because people who get in accidents, or partially because people who get in accidents can't reach anyone to get help. So, if the road also, I want to make sure not to forget to tell you this point, the road is also primarily designed for the semis carrying heavy equipment and machinery back and forth from Fairbanks to Prudhoe Bay to the oil fields up there. So as such, they are considered to have the right-of-way. And I did find this to be very clear to me shortly after leaving Fairbanks and heading north on the Dalton. I was going up this dirt and gravel rise, and coming up over the hill towards me was this enormous bulldozer pushing this large mound of dirt. And the thing that was surreal to me is that he was in my lane, and he was coming towards me, and he could see me, and he was going the wrong way, but he made no attempt to slow down or pull over. And this road has no shoulders, so I just narrowly missed being run over by this large piece of equipment. I did continue north over the next 2 days, and I was very grateful that I made it to Coldfoot Camp the first night, which is the halfway point between Fairbanks and Prudhoe Bay, and then the second night I made it to Prudhoe Bay. And I did encounter winter weather, wildfires, wild animals, and roads that were truly in very bad condition. But I arrived in Prudhoe Bay, super happy to be there. I stayed at a place called Dead Horse Camp. It's a working camp for the oil workers up there, and they do have a trailer that you can stay in and a company cafeteria. And while I was eating dinner at the company cafeteria that night, I met 3 other bikers. They were all guys, and they had all traveled up the Dalton the same time as me. And when you're a motorcyclist traveling on the road, what often happens is when you meet other bikers, there's this kind of instant sense of camaraderie because you're on the road together and you're sharing your stories. And we had a wonderful evening talking about our adventures and mishaps, and I kind of felt like I had made 3 new friends by the time dinner was over. But unfortunately, after dinner, I walked out to my bike in the parking lot, and I could see that there was a nail deeply embedded in my rear tire. This ended up being a significant problem because I could not get the tire repaired until 2 p.m. the following day, and it had been raining all morning. So the roads that had been more of a hard-packed dirt the day before were now this thick, sludgy, muddy mess. And the bike that I had rented, and this was the only bike I could find after weeks, to try to find somebody crazy enough to loan me their motorcycle to ride up the Dalton. This bike has 70/30 tires on it, which means that they were primarily designed for asphalt with some capability on dirt, but almost no capability on mud. So it was really disconcerting to me to head south on those muddy roads because I had so little control of the bike. My bike was shaking back and forth and the handlebars were going all over the place and my heart was hammering in my chest, and it was extremely challenging. I reached a 16-mile section of road construction, and the trip went from being challenging to downright terrifying. There were all these large trucks in this muddy construction area, picking up loads, dropping them off, pulling forward, circling around, beeping, flashing lights, and they were creating these thick ruts in the road that seemed to be going every direction other than the direction that I wanted to be going in. And I'll never forget the pilot car that day. It was this muddy, covered Jeep driven by this middle-aged lady with this big mass of curly black hair, and she was enthusiastically speeding through the mud at speeds up to 55 miles an hour and then abruptly slamming on her brakes. And I'm trying to leave enough space between her and me so that I don't run into her when she slams on her brakes, but not so much space that the semis behind me decide to try to pass me. And to be honest, I was just getting exhausted. I could hardly breathe because my heart had been hammering in my chest for so long, and my muscles were so tired from trying to manhandle the bike. And psychologically, I was overwhelmed because of the constant threat of these semis behind me and seeing their headlights looming in my rearview mirrors all the time. And I got to a point where I thought my life was over. And I remember thinking three things kind of all at the same moment. I thought to myself, what is going to hurt more? Hitting the ground, getting run over by the semi behind me, or if I somehow manage to survive this moment, trying to explain to the nice guy who loaned me his motorcycle how it was I totaled his bike. And I screamed out in my head, I can't do this anymore. And I lifted my hands up off my handlebars. And what happened next was amazing. I felt my bike being lifted up out of that rut and put back in the direction that I needed to go. And my heart rate went down. And I felt a sense of peace come about me. And I can't tell you exactly what happened that day, but I can tell you that to me, it felt like God had lifted me up out of that mud and put me back on the path that I needed to go on. Unfortunately, I hadn't yet made it over Adigan Pass. So some of you may be familiar with Adigan Pass. It is the highest pass in Alaska that is open year-round. And it's about 5,000 feet in elevation. And as I was heading north up this, south, but uphill, I should say, up this muddy mountain pass, the temperature was dropping and my fingers were becoming numb and the rain was turning to snow, and then my low fuel warning light came on. But as I mentioned before, there's no shoulders and I couldn't even find a flat stretch of road, so I just had to keep going. So I continued on and my fingers became more numb, and then my low fuel warning light started flashing furiously, indicating that I was truly in imminent danger of running out of gas. So I finally found this little flat stretch of road and I parked my bike right in the road, and I just really hoped that I could get off the bike and put gas in my tank before a semi came along again. And I almost couldn't get the gas cap off because my fingers were so numb. But I did manage to put gas in my tank. And then, as I'm trying to shove my muddy hand back into my wet glove, I look to the right of me, and there is a sign that says, "No stopping, avalanche zone." So, oh my goodness, I got back on the bike, I continued south, and I'm happy to tell you I did make it to Coldfoot Camp that night. And I'm also happy to be able to tell you that before I got there, the rain stopped and the roads dried out and they became more of that hard-packed dirt that I had been on the day before. When I got to Coldfoot Camp, I was so relieved, and I pulled across the dusty parking lot and I parked at the one gas pump there. So happy to know I could put gas in my tank and that I would have food and shelter. And I looked up, and across the parking lot, I saw the 3 bikers from the night before who were standing outside the restaurant trailer. And I will never forget what happened next. One of them, his name is Mike, this tall, burly biker dude, looked up and saw me, and he yells out, "Kathleen, you made it." And it was like this movie moment because he lifted up his arms and started just like running towards me. And I impulsively lifted my arms up and started running towards him. And he swooped down and picked me up and twirled me around. And I had my helmet still on. And I was literally laughing and crying at the same time inside my helmet. And he puts me down and he says something to me that changes my life. He says to me, "Kathleen, you are the bravest woman I have ever met." And then the 2 other guys are slapping me on the back. And they're going, "Yes, Kathleen, you're so brave, you're so brave." And I thought to myself, I am Kathleen the Brave. And, I've thought about that day so many times since then and asked myself, what is it about my experiences on the road that day that had such a profound impact on my life? And I think part of it has to be that I was able to see myself more fully through God's eyes. You see, so much of my life, I think I've been under this impression that God's grace and provision for me is somehow dependent on my strength or my accomplishments. But when I gave up hope in that muddy stretch of road construction, I had actually lifted my hands up off the handlebars, and I had stopped trying to control the bike at all. Yet God chose that moment to show me the magnitude of his power and provision for me. And when I felt like I didn't have the strength even to go on a second longer, he showed me that he is more powerful than it all. And when I arrived at that dusty parking lot and those 3 bikers so warmly welcomed me, it was almost as if they were a tangible demonstration of God's unconditional love and grace. You see, they responded to me not out of condemnation, but out of love. And all 3 of those bikers knew that I was not riding the proper bike, that I did not have the proper equipment, that I was a relatively inexperienced rider, and that I had, in fact, arrived to camp last. Yet when they warmly welcomed me, they were celebrating my safe arrival instead of focusing on the mistakes that I had taken to get there. And when they swooped me up in their arms and slapped me in the back, I felt so loved and accepted. And I think that loving act of kindness helped me to see that God's grace is not something that I need to earn. My value as a child of God is something that is freely given to me. Thank you. Thank you. I think part part of the reason why I'm so passionate about sharing what I've learned about God and how he sees me, is that the things I've learned have helped me to have more confidence as I approach challenging situations, both on and off the road. So instead of getting stuck in my fear, I've learned to respond to difficulties by asking myself what I would do if fear were not my first thought, and then asking God for the wisdom and strength to take that step, whatever it might be. You see, we are all going to face difficult circumstances. We are all going to encounter obstacles that might seem overwhelming. And we are all going to get news that appears to be extremely unfortunate. But I am confident that we can respond to these circumstances from a position of power versus powerlessness if we trust in God's grace and provision. I'd like to share with you a few examples of the types of ways I've been learning to demonstrate this faith over fear in my own life. The first type of response is one I've kind of already shared with you, and it's the concept of taking a series of small action steps to overcome what might seem like an overwhelming obstacle. You might remember that I shared that in the spring of 2020, I had this really visceral fear of being alone. At the time, I was feeling fairly depressed and demoralized because I was newly divorced and I was looking ahead to summer, and I was really sad about the fact that I didn't think I'd be able to go on a summer motorcycle trip, as I had this several previous years with my husband. But I was absolutely too terrified to go on my own, and I couldn't find anybody else who would go with me. I had prayed and searched for weeks to try to find somebody, but nobody had the summers off and was willing to travel right after the outbreak of the pandemic. And I was also very sad about missing my older son. He lives in Washington, D.C., and we had not seen each other in 6 months. But because of the pandemic conditions at the time, neither of us felt comfortable traveling across the country to see each other. And I was talking with my friend and neighbor, Roger, about my situation, and as guys can sometimes do, he just rather abruptly announced, "Kathleen, I know exactly what you need to do." And I said, "What?" And he said, "You need to take your motorcycle and ride across the country and go see your son." And I responded to him in fear. Immediately I said, "But how would I do that on my own?" And then he said something that changed the trajectory of my life. He really matter-of-factly said, "Well, you've got 3 months to figure that out." And what happened is I stopped thinking so much about all the reasons why I was so afraid to take the trip, and I started thinking about what I would need to do if I wasn't so afraid. And so I decided, well, I would need to get some luggage rack for the back of my motorcycle. I would need to buy some luggage. I would need to figure out which app to use for hotel reservations and which app to use for navigation. I would need to maybe find somebody who I could check in with every night to make sure I was safe. And of course, I would need to call my son and tell him I was coming. And what happened is my circumstances had not changed, but my perspective on those circumstances had changed. And as I took one action step after another, that life-changing journey became a reality. I would like to share with you one other example of that kind of faith-building action steps that's a little bit more recent. So this comes from my recent travels through Africa on my motorcycle this most recent summer. When I was planning for my trip to Africa, and I was doing my planning in the spring of this last year, I do have to say that the idea of traveling to Africa was somewhat daunting for me. It was a place I had never been to. I was very unfamiliar with the language and culture and customs. I knew that it was much less well-developed than what I was used to, and I was also rather overwhelmed by the heat. I had talked to several biker friends who had been to Africa, and all of them cautioned against going during summer because it's so hot during the summers there. But I realized that I had a choice. as a school teacher, I can't change when my vacation time is. So I had to decide, do I either not want to go to Africa, or could I possibly find some ways to mitigate the heat? And I decided to attempt to do that. So I got some extra water containers for my bike. I bought a new cooling vest, which is something you can soak in water, and then when you open your vents, it kind of cools you a little bit when you're riding. And then I switched out all my base layers to 100% merino wool because they breathe better and wick moisture better. And then I plan to leave earlier in the morning and travel shorter distances. And I have to say, it was not easy, but I'm glad I went, and I'm glad I did it. I think there was one day in particular that was particularly challenging. I was riding from this small mountain town called Agudal to another small town called Merzouga on the western edge of the Sahara Desert. And that day, the temperatures were about 110 degrees. And I unfortunately had to spend longer on the road than I had hoped due to my lodging options and where I wanted to be. So I arrived at my hotel in Merzouga around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, really hoping that I was going to find an air-conditioned lobby and some cold water. And I was looking forward to meeting the guide for the camel tour that I was going to go on that night to stay at a luxury tent in the Sahara Desert. And I get to the reception desk, and the guy there tells me that I am going to have to wait for several hours because it is too hot for the camels. And then I find out to my further dismay that the hotel lobby is not air conditioned. In fact, it's just as hot or hotter than it is outside. And so even though I took off my jacket and pants and I was wearing my bike shorts and tank top, I was literally dripping sweat on that hotel lobby floor. It was so hot that I could not charge my iPhone. It said that there was some kind of heat warning that came up on my phone. So I ended up waiting there for over 3 hours, and then I got on this camel, and I have to say I'm so glad I did wait, because that camel ride was one of the highlights of my trip. In fact, I'd say it's one of the highlights of my life. I will never forget being on top of that huge beast and feeling his back going forward and backwards and left and right, and looking way down below me and seeing these enormous feet just kind of carefully and methodically plodding through this thick shifting sand. And the sun was setting to my left, and as I looked to the right, I could see these silhouettes of camels and the riders on the red dunes, and it was just breathtaking. So I think the last couple examples, so there's a picture they're showing, thank you. The last couple examples are just to kind of give you an idea of the kinds of ways I've been learning to take action steps to overcome what might be difficult circumstances. Interestingly enough, I've also learned that there are going to be times when God calls us to pivot. And by pivot, I mean that we get new information, or our circumstances change, or maybe we just have different insight, but we make a choice to take a different path and head in a different direction, sometimes literally. And the example I'd like to share with you guys about this is the day after my night in the Sahara Desert, when I was heading west on my motorcycle to a town called Ouarzazate. And it was still about 110 degrees out that day. And, you know, the thing about Africa that you may not realize is that when you stop for gas or maybe to pick up some food somewhere, there's no air conditioning there either. So you really just do not get a break. When you're on a motorcycle, you have no break from the heat. And what I was finding that day after my night in the desert is that my body had not recovered from the heat the day before. And even though I was stopping every hour to drink 2 liters of water, I still had a very significant headache. I was nauseous and dizzy. My muscles ached. I was feeling kind of weak and disoriented. And I called a member of my pit crew back home. And she said to me, "Kathleen, you are on the verge of coming down with heat stroke, and that can be fatal." So fortunately, I had the presence of mind to get out my map and kind of reevaluate what do I want to do next. And I had been planning on traveling west and then south where it would be even more hot. But instead, I called up this hotel that I had been planning on staying at later on the coast where it was cooler. And I asked them, could I arrive early and could I stay for 2 nights instead of 1? And they were able to accommodate me. And I have to say that I'm so glad that I did, because I was able to recharge and refresh my body. I was in this little hotel right across from the beach, and I could walk right there and put my toes in the water and feel the sand underneath my feet and feel the cool breeze coming off the waves. I ate fresh fish in the local fish shack there. I even splurged and got a massage in my room and read half of a good book. So that time ended up being a real blessing. And you know, I don't know if you found this to be the case, but I think sometimes when we're flexible enough to change our plans based on new information, we can sometimes end up with a plan B that's even better than our original plan. There's another kind of healthy or helpful response to fear that God has taught me to use, and that is to be willing to accept help from others. I mention this because I think sometimes in our culture, we can be under this impression that we're supposed to figure it all out ourselves. But I do think that God often chooses to bless us through others if we're willing to allow that to happen. An example I'd love to share with you about this is a couple years ago, I got a phone call from my new accountant. And she told me that I was going to be owing $10,000 on my taxes in April. And this came as a complete shock to me because I had been working with the same accountant for 20 years before she had retired, and I had always gotten a refund. But in the process of transition from the old accountant to the new one, several things had fallen through the cracks, and so I had this very large and very unexpected tax bill. So that night, I sat down and I looked at my numbers and I realized there was no way that I could see that I would be able to make my monthly house payments, support my 2 college-age children, and go on a motorcycle trip. So I prayed about it. And even though it was very hard for me, I knew it was the right thing to do to give up that summer trip. So I gave it up to the Lord. And the next morning, I got a notice on Facebook that one of my Facebook friends had a birthday. This is a guy that had reached out to me earlier because he had read my first book and it had had a positive impact on his life, and he wanted to thank me and tell me about it. So I called him to wish him happy birthday the morning after I prayed about giving up my trip. And shortly after the conversation started, he said, "Kathleen, where are you going this summer?" And I hesitated because I wasn't sure, should I say something negative on his birthday, But I decided to be honest with him, and I said, I'm not sure if I'm even going on a summer trip. And I told him what happened, and he said, "Well, Kathleen, I was praying last night, and God brought you to my mind. And he asked me to ask you where you were going this summer, and then to offer to help you pay for it." So I have to say that this individual has ended up being a really incredible blessing in my life. I've never actually met him in person, but he's continued to support me because he believes in my message and my work. And because of his help and me working some extra hours that year, I was indeed able to go to Iceland and Northern Europe. So I was very, very grateful for that. I have one more example to tell you about the help that we can receive from others, and that is also from Africa. When I was planning to go to Africa in the spring of last year, I put notices on several Facebook pages asking people, do you have any recommendations about where to stay or ride or places to eat? And this guy named Red, who is a biker in Morocco, contacted me and offered to talk about my trip. And I wasn't really sure how the conversation was going to go because I had never even messaged him before. But it's kind of funny because we hit it off instantly. He immediately nicknamed me Kate, which is something I've never been called before, and then proceeded to tell me, you've got to stay at this hotel because they have a great parking lot for motorcycles, and the manager of this restaurant I know will take care of you. And at one point I said, we're taking a lot of your time. I'm feeling, like, is this asking too much of you? And he's like, no, I really enjoy doing this because I love my country and I love motorcycling. I'm so excited to be able to share this with you. And then after I arrived in Africa, he checked in with me every day, oftentimes more than once a day. Did you go to that restaurant? What did you think of the food? And so he was just so sweet. And I remember there was one night in Marrakesh where he had said, Kathleen, you really need to go to Jama Square, which is this beautiful outdoor market where they have food and arts and crafts and vendors of every kind. And there's a nice mix of locals and tourists. And they did henna body art and had snakes you could hold and all those kinds of things. And Red had suggested that I eat at this particular restaurant and that I asked to be seated on the second floor on the balcony. And he told me what time he thought I should ask for dinner because then I would get to see the lights come on at night. And I decided, why not? I just literally followed all of his directions. And when I was leaving the Jama Square that night, I remember thinking, this has been one of the most delightful nights of my life. And I'm in the hotel taxi going back to my hotel thinking how full of joy my heart is, and Red calls. How did it go? How did you like it? And he says to me, Kathleen, you really need to get a hammam. And I'm like, what's a hammam? And he goes, well, it's where they scrub your body from head to toe and all these different substances and then rinse you with cold and hot water. And I said, why not? So it was already 10 o'clock at night at that point, but I handed my phone to the taxi cab driver, and Red communicated with him in Arabic about how to find a bathhouse open that late at night, and even arranged with a taxi cab driver to drive me home after my hour treatment. So, I think that I would have had a wonderful time in Morocco, whether or not I ever met Red. But I also believe that being willing to accept the advice of a local really did enhance my trip. So I have to tell you guys that it is almost surreal to me to be standing here sharing with you about my adventures on a motorcycle by myself in Africa. Because it was just a few years ago in 2020 that I was too afraid to ride up my own driveway. And I was also so mired in feelings of shame and worthlessness at the time. And I just felt like there was no hope. As I mentioned before, I just felt like I had made too many mistakes for God to ever use me for good again. But what I couldn't see then, and I can see now, is there is no such thing as a mistake too big for God not to redeem. Yeah. His grace is so much more bountiful than I realized, and his love and provision for us does not depend on our performance. He has a future and a hope for us. And the irony is that as I've been willing to step out in faith and move forward rather than getting stuck in my fear, he has given me more courage, more hope, more joy, and more confidence than I ever thought possible. Interestingly enough, as he's helped me to overcome one obstacle after another, he's also shown me that there are going to be times when I am not meant to overcome an obstacle, but that he will be there with me anyway. About a year ago, in May of a year ago, I got a call from my cancer doctor up at OHSU. And he told me that I had 4 tumors in my brain. At the time, this was completely unexpected. I had seen him 2 weeks earlier to do a check on my throat to make sure that my throat was still in remission from my throat cancer, and he had said that everything looked great. But I had explained to him that I was experiencing severe double vision and had been experiencing it for several months. And he recommended that I do an MRI of my brain just to make sure that there were no problems in my brain. And at the time, I had gone to the MRI appointment, I had done the procedure, and I had basically just checked it off my list and gone on with my trip planning for my summer trip, because it just didn't even occur to me that there could really be a problem there. So when he called and said, has anybody called you to talk about your MRI results? I had a very physiological reaction to this. My heart started beating quickly, the blood all rushed to my head, and I couldn't even hear what he was saying for a second. But then the lessons that I've learned on the road kicked in, and I said to myself, God's got this. And I got out a piece of paper and I got out a pen and I sat down at my desk and I said to the doctor, what are our next steps? And over the next few weeks and also months, they did a variety of tests and procedures on me. And what my care team explained to me at the end of all that was that because of the location of the tumors, it would actually be more risky to remove them or biopsy them than it would be to just leave them where they were. So I realized that I had a choice to make. I could spend every day of the rest of my life thinking fearful thoughts about how these tumors might be cancerous or wondering what the impact on my lifespan might be. Or I could try to find a way to reframe my situation in a more positive manner. And what I have just chosen to do is to decide when I ever remember as I'm going out my day, oh yeah, that's right, I have 4 brain tumors. I've trained myself to say, what a precious gift. Because these tumors for me are a tangible daily reminder of the importance of living every day to the fullest. After all, none of us really knows how long we have left to live. As Christians, we know that God knows the number of our days. And I like to think that my tumors haven't actually changed anything. Because from the moment that I was born, God knew exactly how long I had to live on this earth. And He is the one that is in control. I think we would all agree that life is not always going to be easy. We are going to encounter those difficult circumstances, face overwhelming obstacles, or hear that news that we had hoped not to hear. But if we trust in God's grace and provision, we can approach all of these fearful circumstances from a position of strength. Instead of getting stuck in our fear, we can ask ourselves, what would we do if fear were not our first thought? Then we can turn that fear into faith-building action. Pivot if prudent, be willing to accept help from others, or learn to reframe our situation in a way that can bring us peace. I'd also like to encourage you that as we move away from fear and into faith, we have the opportunity not only to change our own lives, but to change the lives of those around us. I'm going to have a hard time not crying on this next part, but this past spring, I got the most touching note from one of my students in my math classroom. She's a sweet young Christian woman, and I'm so happy to be able to tell you that she's here today with her mother and her grandmother. And with her permission, I'd like to read to you part of what she wrote to me. She said, "This year was extremely challenging emotionally and academically. Struggling with the stress of school and losing an entire group of friends who would talk behind my back, sadly, and seeing my boyfriend graduate, a car accident, working with a new horse, and almost crying every single day. I can't tell you how much it brightened my day to see your smile every morning when I walked into the classroom. After reading your book, I learned so much about faith in God. I used to be so scared of being seen alone, but I'm not kidding. After reading your book and seeing you be alone, I'm not scared anymore. As a matter of fact, I prefer to be alone sometimes. I'm not scared if those mean girls see me walking alone. I know that if you can travel to Africa alone on your motorcycle, I can do anything alone. Your book was God telling me that I'm never alone because He is always with me. Thank you for not only being an amazing teacher, but it is so cool to witness God's work through you. Keep it up. Thank you for impacting me so much, Sophia." This heartfelt note really blessed me because it helped me to see that as I work to put faith-building practices into my own life, I can not only change my own life, but have a positive impact on the lives of others. I truly hope that what I've shared with you today has encouraged you to see that through God's grace and provision, we all have a hope and a future. As we move forward in faith instead of fear, we can learn to live life more fully. I like to call this living at full throttle. So I'd like to leave you with this. As you consider the struggles you might be facing, the dreams you've never quite followed through on, or the changes that you'd like to make in your own life, what would you do if fear were not your first thought? Thank you.